Would you spend your honeymoon in a fallout shelter? I could have started this video so many different ways, but how else could I intro a topic that includes Nelson Rockefeller, The Simpsons, news articles about humans being turned into barbecue, and yes, couples spending their Cold War honeymoons in fallout shelters. The story of personal fallout shelters in America is quick and brief. They come in with a boom thanks to Castle Bravo, the need for them expedites thanks to Berlin, and then they simply fell out. Nietzsche famously opined that if one is to fight monsters, you should be careful that one does not become one. One of the interesting aspects about fallout shelters in American culture and why they dropped out so quickly is what Americans discovered when they went digging underground, because it wasn't just fear. So at the dawn of the Cold War, it was assumed that nuclear war would be just a more upscale version of conventional bombing. Public educational materials developed by the American government, such as the 1951 Duck and Cover campaign with Bert the Turtle, emphasized the survivability of blasts with simple shelter. It was generally assumed that special shelters would be prohibitively expensive. As the Eisenhower years dawned, plans started to focus on, instead of simply shelter, simply driving away. With enough warning time, it was assumed that a basic, simple evacuation could get underway. And then the United States permanently altered the face of the Earth at Bikini Atoll in the Marshall Islands. Castle Bravo remains the largest thermonuclear device ever detonated by the United States. Further, a miscalculation resulted in a mistake. The test was initially planned at a 5 to 6 megaton yield. It instead produced a 15 megaton yield, making it 1,000 times as powerful as the US weapons used on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945. Castle Bravo also uncovered another danger that had largely been ignored to this point. Radioactive fallout could travel for hundreds of miles based on meteorological conditions, meaning that the dangers of these weapons weren't restricted to the immediate blast area. Simply driving away necessarily would not save you. The United States government invested tons of money into research as it adjusted its training plans for nuclear disaster. Instead of shelter-in-place plans, civil defense exercises began taking into account potential fallout patterns. The 1956 Operation Alert exercise forecasted a nuclear attack all across the United States, with those local municipalities participating in the exercise. Newspapers were printed, air raid sirens went off. Some towns even contributed their own big booms. The FBI's released documentation from their participation not only revealed where they would evacuate to, but also what their dress code would be in the event of such a massive attack. Shorts weren't allowed. But the American Congress and President Eisenhower couldn't bring themselves to spend the millions of dollars it would take to fund a nationwide fallout shelter program. Even under vast lobbying efforts by administration official Nelson Rockefeller, the most that the federal government would do is issue pamphlets advising people to build their own shelters. As stated by the National Park Service, Eisenhower believed that the estimated costs would be more effectively spent elsewhere. He was also concerned that, taken to its logical conclusion, the construction of a federal shelter system could lead to the creation of a garrison state in which democratic civilian society would find its civil liberties overtaken by the military-industrial complex. In 1958, the Office of Civil Defense Mobilization definitively stated that there would be no massive federally financed shelter construction program, instead offering a national shelter plan of government stimulation and guidance of private shelter construction by citizens. Nelson Rockefeller had left the Eisenhower administration in 1956, becoming governor of New York in 1958. Rockefeller had disagreed with the Eisenhower administration on many issues of national defense, and had convened a panel to discuss those issues. As stated by the MPS, a panel on the military included Edward Teller, known as the father of the hydrogen bomb, and Henry Kissinger, then a professor at Harvard University. Both Kissinger and Teller had a notably hawkish approach to nuclear strategy, favoring massive weapon stockpiling to counter the perceived Soviet military superiority, and thereby deter a first strike on the US. They believed a Soviet nuclear strike could be survivable shelters, and that the prospect of a prepared, protected civilian population would further deter such a strike. Rockefeller would push for the state of New York to require that all new home construction included personal fallout shelters. He became so obsessed with the topic that the Indian Prime Minister noted during a 1960 state visit that all he wants to talk about is bomb shelters. Why does he think I am interested in bomb shelters? Rockefeller's initial plans would get laughed out of the New York State Assembly. Like the federal government, the New York State government would not be footing the bill. But in 1961, a new administration was in town, and world events were starting to heat up. When John F. Kennedy became president, he granted Rockefeller a meeting that May. Rockefeller was the chair of the Civil Defense Committee of the Conference of Governors, and the meeting was largely to humor Rockefeller. Rockefeller was the presumed Republican presidential candidate for 1964, and Kennedy didn't want to appear soft on issues of national defense. Even when, and I quote Kennedy himself, the American attitude towards federal civil defense was largely characterized by apathy, indifference, and skepticism. That really wasn't going to change outside of some extreme outliers like Rockefeller. And then Kennedy met with Khrushchev in Vienna. Attempting to force a final peace settlement on Berlin, the American and Soviet leaders set the stage for a crisis. Kennedy then unveiled plans to invest billions of dollars into national defense, stating in a July address to the American people, "I'm requesting of the Congress new funds for the following immediate objectives: to identify and mark space in existing structures, public and private, that could be used for fallout shelters in case of attack." Kennedy, in essence, was telling the American people to start to prepare to dig underground because the United States was willing to risk it all for Berlin. And then a few weeks later, the Berlin Wall went up. The confrontation in Berlin, one that Americans had overwhelmingly supported, a 1961 Gallup poll had seen that 82% favored the maintenance of American, British, and French forces in Berlin, even at the risk of war, was on. The September 15, 1961 issue of Life magazine would basically be an appeal to the American people on the necessity of fallout shelters, beginning with a letter from Kennedy. Public interest in fallout shelters predictably surged, and Nelson Rockefeller was waiting. And that brings me to this street in Watertown, New York. Amidst the growing tension of the Cold War, Rockefeller and other government officials had an idea. Why not have a typical American family showcase what a typical American fallout shelter experience would be? In October of 1961, an American family took part in a simulated exercise on this street to do exactly that. With the support of the county and state offices of civil defense and the enthusiastic support of Governor Rockefeller, the family of three spent a full week in a personal fallout shelter. Their stay was heavily featured in the local newspapers, with the only training provided being that of civil defense pamphlets the average person would have access to. After a week spent underground getting gradually annoyed at each other in the situation, they emerged greatly in need of a shower. And they weren't the only ones. Or the first. In 1959, Melvin and Maria Minison of Miami, Florida had entered a radio contest sponsored by Bomb Shelters Incorporated. The prize? The first 2 weeks of marriage in a fallout shelter, and then an all-expenses-paid trip to Mexico immediately afterward. The Minisons were featured in Life magazine, and even found their way into one of the Soviet Union's Pravdas. Interestingly enough, the shelter hadn't been finished before they arrived. Instead of a comfortable stay, they spent a sweltering 2 weeks with temperatures often exceeding 90 degrees. In the rush to finish the shelter for the contest, the structure hadn't been properly checked. Which allows me to make a ham-fisted segue into what couldn't be ignored about these shelters and what they represented. As recounted in One Nation Underground, bewildered ordinary citizens faced even more troubling questions as they agonized over whether or not to build a fallout shelter. Could an effective shelter be built inexpensively, or would only the well-to-do be able to provide nuclear protection for their families? If the shelter owner had only enough food and water in his shelter for his family, would he be justified in killing his neighbors if they tried to get in? In the rush to build these shelters, what was being overlooked? On August 18, 1961, Time magazine published the article Gun Thy Neighbor. It opens with this chilling passage. "When I get my shelter finished, I'm going to mount a machine gun at the hatch to keep the neighbors out if the bomb falls. I'm deadly serious about this. If the stupid American public will not do what they have to save themselves, I'm not going to run the risk of being able to use the shelter I've taken the trouble to provide to save my own family." At the same time that Rockefeller was promoting families spending a week in a fallout shelter, the American people were having another conversation. What happens when your neighbor needs help? The price of fallout shelters wasn't exactly cheap, and further, you needed the space to build one. It was quickly noticed that in the boom to build fallout shelters, entire segments of the population were being excluded from safety, simply for not being able to afford them. It was simply not possible for every person to have one. Pictures of fallout shelters in magazines, government pamphlets, and private sales tended to follow the same pattern. Well-dressed people with well-provisioned shelters, happy and smiling through the worst of times. As written by historian Thomas Bishop, nearly 500 million FCDA booklets depicted the all-American family in their fallout shelter, creating a key visual focal point for early conversation about nuclear war in the US, decidedly suburban, heteronormative, and middle-class in nature. This visual of white American families carefully lining shelter shelves with canned goods or taking their children by the hand as they walk towards their underground refuge broadcast a clear government-sanctioned message. A family that is together, well-organized, and ready could survive the next war. As fear increased of what the Soviets could bring, so did the fear of what your neighbors would do to you if the worst happened. To many critics, fallout shelters brought out the worst aspects of human nature, and increasingly, Americans were disturbed by what they found when they went digging. Instead of protecting each other, fallout shelters were dividing people, placing people in a position where they would be forced to decide on the value of a human life. The Twilight Zone episode The Shelter, aired in September 1961, explored this theme, and later is referenced in one of my favorite episodes of The Simpsons, Bart's Comet. In the episode, a family has a fallout shelter while others do not, and a report of an incoming attack causes friendly neighbors to turn on each other as they all seek the inadequate shelter that only one person possesses. Suddenly, the danger disappears as the report was only a false alarm. People wanted to go back to normal, but the memory of what had just happened remained. By that Thanksgiving of 1961, the world still hadn't ended. The gun thy neighbor controversy and the political commentary reflected by the Twilight Zone had coalesced under one general thought. Americans were worried that the world was going to end, and were in fact quite fatalistic about it. But they weren't willing to dig themselves underground to survive it. By April 1962, Rockefeller would drop his crusade for personal fallout shelters, having been informed that it was a political loser. In a January 1962 article in Life magazine, so 4 months after that same magazine had stated the absolute necessity of a personal fallout shelter, the following passage appeared. If they had a fireproof community fallout shelter, those inside might live through the attack even if a firestorm developed overhead. But upwind, to the west in New Jersey, the situation would be different. There, the survivors would get little fallout, but they would get fire. Like the people in Hempstead, if their shelters were designed for fire protections, they could survive. But if they had shelters designed solely for the fallout, and stayed in them instead of quickly trying to flee to open area, they might be barbecued. Over the past year, Americans had discussed the ethical merits of personal fallout shelters and the necessity of potentially turning on each other for the small scrap of personal protection that they might provide. Yet with the beginnings of 1962, it turns out that those shelters might not have offered you any protection in the first place. You can't put the genie back into the bottle, and the push for personal fallout shelters resulted in a lot of community-based fallout shelters. You are likely still to see one in your local neighborhood. But the memory remains of what it took to get there. One that probably wouldn't taste any better with barbecue sauce.